There's loads of different acronyms in general practice when you talk about clinical and organisational, and in this video we're going to cover all the various organisational ones that you may have heard of, may not have done, and I've got Dr. Susie Bailey from the GP Task Force to help explain all these to you. We're going to cover that right now. Let's tech enhance your primary care and learning. This is the first time we're meeting. I'm Dr. Gandalf of EGP Learning, where I look at supporting you where technology enhance primary care and learning. And in this video we're going to cover all the various different acronyms that come across in terms of general practice, particularly from an organisational aspect. Some that may help you, some you may need to be aware of, and those that you definitely want to stay far away from as best as you can. And as I said, we've got Dr. Susie Bailey from the GP Task Force in Derbyshire to help us explain all these for you. How are we doing today, Susie?
Yeah, good, thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
So do you want to introduce yourself? So some of our viewers may not know who you are, but more importantly, what the GP Task Force is.
So I'm Susie Bailey. I'm a GP in Derbyshire and I clinically lead something called the General Practice Task Force, which is a project arm of the LMC.
Okay.
So we run loads of things to help provide wraparound care for Derbyshire general practice, particularly around people or practices that are struggling or those that want to develop.
Cool. So really good work then.
Hopefully, yeah, hopefully.
and for our viewers and listeners, I've actually been to a few of the GP Task Force events over the past couple of years, and the feedback has been amazing from the people in the room, so definitely it's doing some great work. Today we're going to have a look at all the various different acronyms, because particularly when you're newly qualified, or to be honest, even if you've been in practice for a while, there's lots of different changes that happen, and we're going to cover all those various different organisations and stuff. I guess it's probably best to start with the one we all probably know of, so the NHS, obviously. Yeah,
start with the biggie, the National Health Service, but it's not quite that straightforward, is it?
It's not, unfortunately.
So there are lots of sort of different iterations of NHS with various letters added onto the end. So NHS England we probably know all about. It's the big health service that decides what we do basically day in, day out. But also NHSI we more recently hear about. So what do you know about NHSI?
Does it stand for interfering?
I don't think so. Try again.
Improvement.
Yeah. And so NHSE and NHSI have kind of come together now, haven't they, as one entity. So you might hear the terms mentioned, but just think of it as part of the National Health Service. And then there's one I think that you'll be very interested in, which is the newly announced NHSX, which is all about sort of digital transformation. Definitely.
So the new contract obviously puts massive emphasis on digital transformation for the healthcare service. I slightly have suspicions that the reason they came up with the name NHSX is because it actually got announced shortly after the iPhone X dropped. And, we all know Matt Hancock loves his tech and all that kind of stuff, so I'm pretty sure he thought, let's call it NHSX. Yeah?
We'll start wearing Apple logos.
I mean, personally, I would have gone more down the route of X-Men being the reason, but I don't get to control that kind of thing. But yeah, so NHSX, obviously this newer organisation, and it's, the questions are whether it's going to replace NHS Digital, which is the current tech arm. I think it's actually slightly separate, that they are going to stay as separate organisations from my understanding, but definitely new, and there's a massive emphasis on NHSX being effective and functioning, and I think we're going to see a lot of stuff coming down from them pretty soon actually.
And so is your thought that that will be more sort of the transformative, bigger picture, wide
definitely
thinking stuff?
I think in terms of the kind of the grassroots impact, that kind of stuff, front line kind of thing, we're going to see more coming from NHSX, and the steer, whereas NHS Digital will be the kind of like organisation above it to give the direction and the governance kind of thing more than the actual operational side of it. So yeah, they're probably the main NHS ones that we've come across. I mean, there are a variety of others, and we're going to cover another one shortly. So we've covered the kind of national ones. I guess if we go a bit closer to home, we've got more regional organisations.
So locally, most people will know that their local health services are commissioned by the CCGs or clinical commissioning groups, which have always been sort of very much supposed to be clinically led organisations to try and make sure that the health services in a locality are kind of meeting the needs of that population.
And that came about following the Health and Social Care Act, so the HSCA that some of you may have heard of. This obviously radical act that came into effect and basically changed all the statutory powers of all the organisations, and from that came CCGs. That's caused some complications because it was a massive change to the kind of governance and the law side of things. And we're still seeing, I think, some of the impact of that. But obviously from CCGs we then developed other organisations that have now come into play but aren't necessarily statutory organisations. So ones that people may have heard of as the STPs. Can you explain that to us?
So STPs are Sustainability and Transformation Partnerships, originally plans, and they fit sort of 44 footprints across the country. And again, that's sort of a wider collaboration of health and social care provision and planning for the locality, which CCGs feed into, but also things like the local trust will feed into, social services and things like that will feed into as well.
Okay, and they're kind of transforming into other organisations, which we're going to cover in a little bit. But before we get to them, we're going to go through kind of those more supportive organisations, the ones that kind of exist to try and help you guys and things. So I guess the first and foremost one that almost every GP should have heard of is the LCGP.
Yeah, it would be impressive to get through your training without her. The Royal College of General Practitioners.
I mean, clearly they do your exams, and the exams themselves have loads of acronyms. So you've got your CSA, the Clinical
Skills Assessment.
Yeah, Clinical Skills Assessments. You've got your AKT, the Applied Knowledge Test. You've got your Work-Based Placed Assessment, WBPA. And within those, there's so many more acronyms that I think if we were to go through those, you guys would probably switch off. So we're not going to do that. But obviously the LCGP is our Royal College and they're for education and standards in terms of the profession. It does seem to have quite a representative role, and particularly over the past few years we've seen a huge shift to try and do that, and we've had things obviously previously like GP Forward View, and lately the bigger things that have hit us like the new GP contract and the long-term plan that they've had significant input into in combination with other organisations. But the LCGP doesn't have the greatest name at times, does it?
I think it's kind of changed over time, and it's sometimes difficult to gauge what the thoughts and feelings are of people working across the country, and it's difficult to always get that right. So I think it's useful from the Royal College of GP's point of view to point out that for Derbyshire in particularly, you do have to look sometimes as to which local deanery looks after you. So we've got, local faculty looks after you. So for those in sort of Derby and Erewash, it'll be the Vale of Trent faculty, which you're involved with, but more up towards Chesterfield, it's the South Yorkshire North Trent faculty, so just to be aware of that. And then I think the other thing for newly qualified GPs from the colleges that's great is the First 5 programme, which I know you've been involved in the past. Yeah,
so I mean the First 5 was created about coming up to 10 years ago, because it was when I qualified, and that was an initiative that kind of realised that VTS, so Vocational Training Scheme Training, or as they're now called AITs, even more acronyms people, so that's Associates in Training, is the official term for your GP trainees. Once they finish, they don't have the protection of the training schemes and that kind of stuff, and sometimes they can end up just being left to flounder around. And we saw massive issues with retention in the profession as a result of that. So part of the initiative that the LCGP came up with was the First 5 to try and give that extra support. And actually, I think it's done some really positive stuff. There is this clear recognition of the drop-off point, but also in terms of giving that pastoral support and more importantly keeping it on people's minds. I guess people have also wanted it to get bigger, so maybe go to first 10 possibly, or first 20 with the way things are currently going, but definitely useful and worthwhile. I think one of the things to remember though is that, like you said, is the best way probably to engage with the LCGP is with the local faculty. And I guess particularly for the local area of Nottingham and Derbyshire, you're probably right, slightly more Nottingham centric. I think that's partly by going to people who want to have engagement with it, because trying to move it towards the further areas has been challenging, but definitely work that needs to be done. I agree with that. And
it's great, really good opportunity to get involved.
Yeah, definitely. And actually it's not just the educational stuff that they pride themselves on, it's also the social. So as some of our viewers will know, I love my games nights, and they're going to become legendary. We've got a plan to try and even make that better for you guys. So people who aren't in the area, I'm really sorry you're going to miss out. You can copy us if you want. So we covered the LCGP. I guess outside of that, the other one we have to talk about is clearly our union, the BMA.
Yes, the British Medical Association, which is our union basically. There are other unions. but BMA tends to be the biggest one that most people know about. And for general practice, it becomes a little bit more complicated. Because although the BMAs are union, we have the GPC or General Practice Committee of the BMA, which does the sort of big national negotiations of our contracts. So it's really important that you're aware of what they do. They've got some really useful information, particularly for sessional GPs, on their website. So I'd really recommend people look at things like what should be in a salaried contract. There's a really good new document out about expectations for locums. So really, I'd suggest you have a look at that.
And also for our newly qualified kind of colleagues and stuff, it's important to remember they also have other subgroups that sit within them. So they've got the JDC, the Junior Doctors Committee, and they've got the JDC arm, wasn't it, the annual regional meeting? So
the annual regional meeting kind of has people from all different aspects of the big BMA family, if you like, coming together and discussing issues that apply to medicine as a whole.
And I guess then we've got the BMA, we've got the GPC. There's another one that kind of sits with them as well, isn't there?
And another one that I'm quite passionate about. So
we both are,
that's your local medical committee. So local medical committees are sort of your local negotiating body and also your local representative body. And they're made up of GPs that really want to support other GPs, want to make sure that we develop general practice, but also make sure that we protect general practice at the same time, and you can do both. And so if there are negotiations and conversations happening about general practice that will affect you within your LMC area, LMC members and representatives will be there, and then they in turn feed up to the GPC that we mentioned earlier to help sort of formulate thoughts and processes based on that local intelligence as well as the national intelligence as well.
Definitely. So just to be clear, for declaration of interest, both Susie and myself are representatives for our local LMC, so myself for Nottinghamshire and Susie for Derbyshire and things, so there is that slight thing to be aware of. But yeah, definitely worthwhile organisations. I've enjoyed being part of the LMC for the past year and a bit, and I feel it's had real impact in terms of some of the changes that are coming by, particularly with the newer things. So PCNs is the big buzzword, isn't it?
So I think you've probably been lying under a bush really if you haven't heard about the new contract and the changes that that's going to make to general practice. And I think most people are kind of quite positive about that. We know that there's a problem in general practice, we know there's a workforce problem, we know that there's a workload problem, and we know that we've got issues with lots of retirements coming up, and we've got a growing population which is becoming, having more and more sort of comorbidities, particularly as they get older. And I think there's a real recognition, and there has been for a while, that there is a difficulty with small surgeries trying to cope with that increasing workload burden with that diminishing workforce. So what the primary care network contract basically does is encourage practices to start working together to kind of look at wrapping around care around patients, working sort of collaboratively with other services such as things like the voluntary sector, so that includes things like introduction of social prescribers into general practice, and look at a change to the skill mix of our general practice workforce, so bringing in things like pharmacists, physiotherapists and that kind of thing. And the other word that you might hear mentioned with PCNs is CDs, which are the clinical directors. So each primary care network will have a clinical director. They might be a partner, a locum, sessional, they might not even be a GP. There are nurses and pharmacists being primary care.
And interestingly, there's even one that's a GP registrar. So technically anybody working within primary care can be a clinical director. Again, slight declaration, I'm one for my local area.
I'm not.
But yeah, definitely this newer role that we're going to see kind of leading the local delivery arm of primary care effectively, which is I think how it's being badged. It's not a statutory change or that kind of thing, it's more a new delivery mechanism, kind of like a Lego block, I think is probably the way I've thought about it.
More kind of like sort of an ethos, a different way of working as opposed to something that seems to necessarily be written in stone from a legal standpoint, because people are coming up with very different ways of developing their own PCN. So across the country prior to the contract, we did already see practices working together. So in some places that was a federated model where which is basically a legal structure to bring federations to bring practices together within a federation. In some places there are things like super partnerships, which again is a very large partnership comprising of several different surgeries. So they are by and large almost at the forerunners for primary care networks to an extent, and sometimes you'll find that the federation and PCN are the same. Sometimes they'll be part of a PCN, or so there's the ways that those different legal entities exist within primary care networks, but you just might hear about those as well.
Yeah, and I think we would love to cover all the various different acronyms that may be relative to yourself in terms of federations and stuff, but the reality there's so many, we're not going to be able to cover those for you in this video, but definitely worth having a look at. So we've got the PCNs, and then we've also got other structures that are going to sit around and above the PCNs.
Yeah, so I think primary care networks, it's all about integration, isn't it?
Yeah.
So integrated care is the big kind of phrase that's going around, and so the things that you'll hear about are sort of ICPs, which are integrated care partnerships, and that's the sort of more locality based. Often it seems to fit around kind of county council or district council borders. And again, that's talking about healthcare, social care, voluntary sector, all working to wrap around the patient to try and make sure that you're providing care in the right place at the right time. And so from these ICPs, or integrated care partnerships, we then look at kind of system-wide, and we're talking about kind of county-wide. So from my point of view, that's across Derbyshire. We're looking at sort of integrated care systems, which is all that ICP stuff, but just on a bigger scale to all intents and purposes.
Yeah, so I mean, most ICSs we're talking about areas that cover millions worth of patients, so it can be 1 to 1.5 million worth of patients, so quite significant areas, and they're going to basically sit at the top of this kind of pecking order. And I think if someone was to try and create a diagram that kind of gave you the organisational structures of healthcare, I think A, it's changing on a near daily basis for number one, but B, it would look quite complicated. But I think long and short of it, you've got Department of Health and NHS England at the kind of the top of it. Underneath that, you're going to have your CCGs as commissioners, and they kind of sit alongside the ICSs, and then ICPs, and then go down to PCNs and practices, and then obviously you'll have other things like your hospital services and that kind of stuff towards the side and things, and dotted around there pretty much everyone else.
Yeah, I think some people have written it, sort of drawn it really nicely as an onion with the patient at the centre and then the layers built on it. And also the ICSs will include things like your trusts, and they'll be very much integral to that in order to make sure that the patient care, patient flows are correct for those individuals that really need that care. Okay.
And I then guess it'd be worth just briefly talking about the educational side of things. So we've got another organisation that kind of sits around, as we've mentioned, so HEE.
Yeah, Health Education England. HEE. And that may be a letter on the end depending which area. So within the Midlands we're HEEM, aren't we?
Yeah.
And Health Education England are involved with a huge amount of things. They will deanery, they will not just general practice education. So things like GP fellowships will be run by HE. But also they'll do things like training for things like advanced nurse practitioners and other members of the healthcare workforce. So there's quite a lot of activity going on with HE, so it is quite interesting to see what happens. And they're obviously very integral to trying to make sure that this skill mix within general practice works effectively.
So I guess with HE, they've also got their own kind of like delivery mechanisms. So some people may call them training hubs, in other areas they'd be called CPENS. Can you tell us what that is?
Community Education Provider Networks.
And they kind of offer their training support for the variety of the multidisciplinary teams. So it's not just GPs and GP trainees, but also, like you said, AMPs, nurses, pharmacists, physicians associates, all those different kind of things that are coming through.
And that sort of the work of the training hubs looks quite different to different areas as well, and also some of the provision crosses organisations, because we for the GP task force we work closely with our training hub to help kind of provide as much support as possible and educational support.
So we talked about the organisations that kind of sit around us and try and support us, but I guess it's important to also remember the contracting status that we have here in primary care and general practice. So some of our listeners and stuff may have heard of all the various different acronyms. I know the three that I always come across is GMS, PMS and APMS. Can you explain those for us, Susie?
Yeah, well, these are ones that I always get confused with as well. So you've got your General Medical Services contract, which is your GMS service. Now, broadly, that is the nationally negotiated contract, so it affords quite a lot of protection. This is the one that your BMA GPC will negotiate. And so quite a lot of practices are now GMS. Then probably the next one down in terms of numbers is the is the personal medical services, which is PMS, and that tends to be look quite a lot like the national contract, but then have local variety and extra things added onto it, and then that extra thing will have a locally determined fee that goes with that extra thing. So
to be clear to our listeners and stuff, one of the things to remember is that PMS is actually kind of going away a little bit. There's been a shift to take all practice towards GMS. Right or wrongly, a lot of people will sit on either side of that debate in terms of what's fair and what's appropriate and what's equal or equitable. But important to know that they are kind of going away.
And I think there's been winners and losers, hasn't there?
Definitely.
As with many of these things.
Yeah.
And so the last one is the Alternative Provider Medical Services Contract, or APMS. These are, again, locally determined. They tend to be quite short-lived contracts. They can be quite lucrative, but they're being short-lived, you lose some protection that way.
Definitely.
And they can also be contracted out to non-NHS entities.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you have seen it, but certainly we've seen it where APMS contracts have been awarded when a practice has been closed quite suddenly, and they need somebody to get it in quickly. So it's funded reasonably well, but on a short-term basis.
So typically your caretaker contracts, or those kind of ones that may cover things like walk-in centres or urgent care centres, they tend to be APMS, or kind of those areas that are just a little bit unusual. So we've got one which is the inner city of Nottingham, so an APMS practice that works from there, like you said, short contract, so theirs is for a fixed length of time and things.
Sort of a risk-benefit
Definitely.
discussion needs to be had around
more
those.
money because you're there for shorter, and whether it's renewed or not kind of gets decided about 2 or 3 months before it gets renewed, as with most things in the NHS. And I guess underneath those important contracting, I guess acronyms to be aware of would be the DESs and the LESs.
Yeah, so these are various types of enhanced services, and whether they're locally enhanced services or direct enhanced services. So this will just be extra things on top of the standard contract. So examples that I can think of might be things like a home visiting service.
Yeah.
It might be things like, you come up with some from Nottingham that you can think of while I'm thinking.
So in terms of LESs, we've got the care homes one that provides extra funding for going out and looking after the care home patients in a slightly different and more interventional way, so regular reviews for patients in care homes, that kind of stuff, and making sure that they get various different things done. I guess if you're looking for the poster child for the DESs, the current one would be the new GP contract, because the amendment to that basically come in that's allowed for the creation of primary care networks and stuff is actually a DES. So it is optional and it's a direct contract that's provided, but clearly there's views on whether if you do or don't take it, how that's going to impact you. But it is a direct enhanced service by definition. It's not necessarily part of the GMS contract like we talked about earlier, so therefore it technically is optional. So I guess important to talk about some of the other organisations that kind of sit way above those kind of ones, and possibly the ones that fill some people with dread, I guess.
Yeah. So I think we've left those, haven't we? Because of the fear factor. So I think the big one is the General Medical Council, the GMC, and the reason that fills us with fear is we automatically think of GMC investigations, but the GMC's got a really important role. It's around sort of patient safety, also sort of performance, enhancing performance for GPs, making us better at our job, and an educational role. But obviously part of their role is if something goes wrong or there's a concern about a GP's performance, then things need to sort of get ramped up in order to make sure that patients are protected. And part and parcel of the GMC is potentially another acronym that you might have heard of, which is PAG, and that's the Performance Advisory Group. And that's the sort of local discussions about fitness to practice.
Okay.
To all intents and purposes.
Yeah. And I guess that may be different to one of the other PAGs, which unfortunately is the exact same acronym, which is the Professional Advisory Group.
Yeah, and that tends to be a meeting that happens as part of the CCG with lots of professionals chatting about what's going on within the CCG and helping to make decisions.
And that's probably even more regional and local.
As far as I know, yeah.
And so we talked about the GMC, like you said, our regulator, effectively, that we all have to be registered with. And kind of with that is also the performers list, I guess. Now, it's not necessarily an acronym, but you need to be on the performers list, because if you aren't, you cannot work as a GP. So if you're not sure, go and check. Please do. And then the other one that we all hear about on a regular basis that fills most GPs with frustration.
And mainly practice managers.
And practice managers is CQC.
Yeah, so the Care Quality Commission, which is, I can't even think how long it's been around for now.
I think it was similar to the Health and
Was
Social
it
Care
around
Act.
at the same time, so 2012-ish?
Yeah, it was brought in by the Health and Care Social Act, so same time as CCGs effectively.
Okay. And so that's kind of your inspectorate of practices. And yes, people hear about CQC and then the ratings tend to be whether somebody's outstanding, good, requires improvement or inadequate, and those tend to be the 4 things, and they examine across a number of areas.
And clearly create a lot of work for practices, and whether that's justified or not is going to constantly be the debate. I think one of the things I would recommend anybody that's concerned about the CQC, the first thing you do is just have a look at their Mythbusters, because there is a lot of myths about what they do and how they do things, so definitely worth checking that part of the website out, and we'll put the link of that in the show notes for you guys as well. So we talked about GMC and CQC. There is a kind of another group of organisations that sits around us that supports us, but sometimes people feel a little bit frustrated with, and it's one that's massively changed lately as well, and that's the MDOs. So that's
or defence organisations basically. So there are quite a few of them, so you'll heard of things like the MPS Medical Protection Society, MDU Medical Defence Union, and then there's a number of other ones as well.
So there's MDDUS, which is the Scottish version, Medical Defence Department, something Scotland, sorry, forgotten the U, Union of Scotland, that was it, Union of Scotland, and MDS, the Medical Defence Society. So there are actually 4 in existence that you can use in terms of UK. Technically you can go privately to separate law companies and indemnity providers in that respect, but those are the 4 kind of like big ones for primary care.
And I'm sure most people realise that indemnity was skyrocketing, so as a consequence of that we were very delighted to hear that there is now, as part of the nationally negotiated contract, a state-backed indemnity. I'm going to get you to do this one because I always forget the wording.
So it's the Clinical Negligence Service for General Practice, CNSGP, that's administered by another NHS organisation, so you may remember we talked about this, called NHS Resolution. So I will put the contact details for that, because a lot of people are still unsure how they access that kind of service, and there's been some really good presentations by colleagues at various different events lately, and I've got contact details. So basically if you've got a question who you need to contact, I will put those details in the show notes for you guys.
And I think the important thing to realise is that although there is state-backed indemnity, you do also need your own indemnity as well, and so the conversations around what that indemnity looks like have been slightly more complex depending on whether you're doing out of hours work, whether you're doing extra higher risk activities like minor ops and that kind of thing. So do have a chat with your MDO, your medical defence organisation provider, and they'll be able to talk you through that.
But definitely has made a noticeable change. So for personal effect, my indemnity has dropped from approximately £8,500 a year down to just under £1,000 for this coming year, and potentially even lower depending on which company you go with. But do look at what they offer, because they do all offer different things for what you're covering, and that's why the prices are different, because of the way they structure it. So important to look at the detail. But yeah, definitely a welcome change, I think, for the profession, and possibly something that may mean that some of us stick around a little bit longer, because obviously indemnity was basically making people leave, which was unfortunate. So we talked about loads of different organisations and acronyms and all that kind of stuff. I guess it's important to finish off, I think, on some more local ones for you guys. So we've talked obviously about the faculties and the LMCs and that kind of stuff, but your organisation, the GP Task Force.
So I'm really, really proud of what we do at the General Practice Task Force. So basically I would just say to you, if you're working in a practice that's struggling a bit, or would like to merge, or would like to help developing in any way, or you're an individual GP who is struggling at a crossroads in terms of career choice, or just doesn't know necessarily where to turn, you can contact the General Practice Task Force, and we'll have a GP advisor who can help you. We're also doing quite a lot around facilitating PCN discussions at the moment, and our website is gptaskforce.com. So if you have a look on those, all the contact details, and there's also a sort of single point of access where you can just fill in contact details, say what you need, and let us know. We talked about First 5 as well earlier, and there's also a national initiative to do more and more for the First 5.
Definitely.
So we're helping support that as well. So yes, doing loads.
Yeah. And to be clear on that point as well, again, slight declaration, this episode has been sponsored by the GP Task Force, and there's future ones coming for your benefit, so make sure you subscribe so you can get all that content first and foremost. And I guess just to mention one more organisation that kind of offers a bit more of pastoral support for people in the local area. Do you want to talk about the GPS?
Yeah, so GPS Mentoring, or GPS, is a fantastic service which is funded part by Nottingham LMC and Derbyshire LMC, which offers free one-to-one mentoring and coaching for any GP within Nottinghamshire and Derbyshire, and you get up to 4 sessions, which is 8 hours provided coaching, mentoring. So, and I really want to point out that it's not just for people in crisis or for people nearing crisis. Actually, for development, coaching is really important, and I think it should be part and parcel of sort of everyday learning and general practice, because it is such a useful thing. So yes, contact them, and also all those details and contact details you can find on the GP Task Force website, which I mentioned earlier.
Yes, and links to all of those things will be in the show notes, guys, so if you want to check that out, feel free to have a look. You'll have all of that information easily accessible for you. We've talked about loads of different organisations. You may want to go back and have another look at the video, feel free to do so, or have a listen to the episode all over again. And as I said, there will be more content provided and sponsored by the GP Task Force for your benefit coming over the coming months and stuff. And I'd love to thank Susie for joining us today to help kind of navigate this really complicated area, because even we forget the acronyms.
Yeah, so sorry if we got any of them wrong.
There are that many of them, and there's even more. Like I said, there's so many that we haven't covered in this episode, just because we know that your time is valuable and we want to make sure that this is as concise and as effective as it can be. As always, guys, if you want to make sure you subscribe to all of our content and ring the bell, it's in the top corner over there, to make sure you get all this stuff first and foremost. And as always, feel free to contact or comment on any of this kind of content. We're on all of our platforms, so Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, YouTube, and any podcasting network that you may want to consider. And if you've got any questions, like I said, feel free to send them down. And we're here to try and help save you and your patients' time by tech enhancing your primary care and learning.